Good afternoon. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today in the studio, Vanessa Beeley. Thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome.
We are joined today by Jean Bricmont, who is a theoretical physicist, political commentator, and author of the book that you can see on screen there, Humanitarian Imperialism, Using Human Rights to Sell War. Welcome to the program, Jean.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, we're going to begin with this sad piece of news. Vanessa, a prominent Syrian general.
Yeah, very sad. General Issam Zahreddin was killed in Deir ez-Zor, having fought valiantly to liberate Deir ez-Zor. He was killed. His car apparently hit a landmine. Now this is a general of the Tiger Forces, one of the most formidable Syrian Arab Army forces battling NATO member state terrorism inside Syria for the last 7 years. So it's a huge loss to the Syrian people, to the Syrian army, and to all those that believe that Syria is genuinely containing a huge terror threat within its borders.
Another piece of news that came out of Syria today was this, that the SAA has discovered an ISIS chemical workshop in eastern Homs.
Yes.
The rhetoric and the narrative about chemical weapons in Syria hasn't changed. And although there is some gentle acknowledgement from the OPCW and others that ISIS have used chemical weapons in Syria, the narrative continues to be that the chemical attacks are government-inspired. What are your thoughts on this?
Wow, I mean, it's indicative of the amount of obfuscation that's coming from the NATO-aligned media. We know that Serena Shem in 2014 was potentially, very possibly murdered by the Turkish intelligence agencies because she exposed the fact that chemical weapon ingredients and weapons were passing over the border from Turkey to Syria to the terrorist factions inside Syria. So it's no great surprise, but of course it's also no great surprise that Western media is ignoring this evidence.
Jean, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on the whole chemical weapons situation in Syria and perhaps this latest revelation.
Well, I'm not surprised by the revelation because already in 2013, when there were this chemical attack in the Ghouta that was blamed on the so-called regime, it was first of all very unlikely a priori because the Assad government has asked people from the UN to come and check these chemical weapons stories, so it would be foolish for them to launch a chemical attack right at that time. But then also, of course, later there was this famous MIT report, which I'm sure you all know about, which shows that it's for physical reasons, it's almost impossible that the weapon attack came from the Syrian government. So it must come from the rebel areas. And if it comes from the rebel areas, they must have chemical arsenals or chemical, factories, chemical weapon factories. So I'm not surprised. I'm not an expert on chemical weapons.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, look, thank you for that. Now let's move on to this, Vanessa. This is a story that you've put up on 21st Century Wire. It's written by Diane Johnson, and both Diana Johnson and Jean have been writing for a long time for Counterpunch, and this article appeared on Counterpunch.
This article, I believe, Jean, was originally published at Counterpunch, and it came from Diana Johnston, right? And the extraordinary thing is both Jean and Diana have been writing for years for Counterpunch. And what we've seen recently, and I think, Jean, you will agree with me, we've seen a divergence in approach from Counterpunch in the recent months, maybe even years. And we've seen, we've seen attacks from them against writers such as Caitlin Johnson, and now against Diana, in fact, for this article and
even when they attack Caitlin Johnston, they say, what about Diana Johnson? We should attack her too. So it's very shocking that they take somebody whom I think Paul Craig Roberts called a non-entity to attack one of their best writers, their most famous writer, etc. But of course, I've been looking. We expected the article by Diana to provoke some reactions, so I've been checking their Facebook page. On the Facebook page, the reactions were uniformly negative, and there's been enormous amount of, pro-Antifa articles on Counterpunch. I mean, this whole thing is absurd beyond belief. You see, the problem is that, well, first of all, I don't believe that there is a risk of fascism in the Western countries nowadays in the sense of fascism in the 30s with a single-party dictatorship, with a leader, a duce, a Führer, etc., the helm, etc. I mean, this seems to be zero chance. All the parties that are called fascist work within the constitutional order, try to win the elections, and there is no indication that they would overthrow the constitution for the simple reason. I mean, they never announced that they will do that, and Hitler and Mussolini were never hiding the fact that they would take power and exercise a dictatorship. That was part of their doctrine. I mean, nobody has that doctrine now, so it's not so easy to take power, by hiding your intentions, because your supporters don't know that, your supporters don't support that, and I don't see how they would do it. So in the sense of fascism, in the historical sense, it seems to me just a fantasy. And that's why what they call fascism, well, first of all, if there was a risk of fascism, then the first thing to do would be to unite the masses and do a united front, as was done in the 30s, including by the communists after some hesitation. They made anti-fascist front in order to stop fascism. Namely, you have to unite people, but the last thing you should do if you want to unite people is to do this random violence against speakers, against individuals, etc. I mean, this is sure that this alienates the vast majority of the American people. So that's not a way to stop fascism, it's a way to encourage fascism. So all this anti-free speech thing is very un-American, it's even anti-European and very un-European, and it's something that just backfires. So this is completely crazy. If what they say is true, that there is this risk of fascism, which I don't believe, but if there is, it's true.
Sorry.
Okay.
So Diana has written this article, Antifa, Self-Appointed Radical Revolutionaries or Neoliberal Thought Police. As I say, it originally appeared in Counterpunch, and then Counterpunch published this article, which was a response to Diana's article, and it was called The NIMPY Critique of Antifa. So, Jean, what were the main points that Diana was making, and what is it that Counterpunch has taken umbrage with?
Yeah.
Yes, and in order that they publish this article?
Well, you see, I mean, Diana defends the principle of free speech, so she of course thinks that taking away free speech means you are taking away from the people who are anti-war the only thing that's left to them, namely to protest against wars. And the Antifa, as far as I know, never do anything against wars. Even myself, I've been victim of Antifa several times in France and banned. For example, I was prevented from speaking in something called the Fête de l'Humanité, which is a big left gathering in September in 2012, and I was prevented because of my position on free speech. And then, of course, that's considered far right, and then I couldn't speak about war and peace. So several other speakers have been trying to speak on war and peace, and they've been prevented from doing that by so-called anarchists, so-called anti-fascists, etc. And of course, defending free speech is also considered far right. So if international law and free speech are far right and are fascist, then I don't understand, because certainly, obviously, Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and company had no respect for free speech, and they had no respect for international law, such as it existed back then, or the sovereignty of other states. So, I mean, this is crazy beyond belief. But that's one of the points. I don't remember the whole article, but that's one of the points she was making, that this Antifa business is just counterproductive and self-destructive.
Where did Antifa come from, Jean? I mean, where did they sort of generate from? Who are they?
The two people who attacked Diana most violently come from Israel, but I don't think Antifa all come from Israel. But obviously, it's very easy to excite the adrenaline level of young males and use that to stir their anger against racism and fascism and so on. And this is sort of, we had that after 68. We had the Maoist movement, etc. We had a lot of movement that were very radical, and also we had the terrorist movement after 68, Red Brigades and so on, which in my view were very counterproductive and we had this sort of, but they were convinced that they were preparing the revolution, etc. While again, like the Antifa, they were alienating the masses. So it was completely self-destructive movement. I think it's the same thing happening now. You know, these people could easily be manipulated. You don't have to be a so-called conspiracy theorist to say that. There's an article by the other Johnstone, Caitlin Johnstone, which just came out, where she makes a list of all the maneuvers, all the movement that were thoroughly infiltrated by the FBI, for example, in the United States. I mean, as a joke, people say that the Communist Party after the war, which was suppressed, was surviving only because of the FBI members infiltrating it and paying their dues. And certainly Trotsky's movements were infiltrated and all kinds of movements were infiltrated. So when people have totally crazy tactic, I have no proof that they're infiltrated because I believe people can be crazy, but I suspend my judgment to say that they are not infiltrated.
So, Jean, again, you know, I'm still interested to know what Counterpunch's motivations for this are, and how does Counterpunch's editorial position, has it changed, in fact?
Well, I actually wrote to the editor-in-chief, Jeffrey St. Clair, to protest against this article. I can't give you the detailed answer because it's private, but in outlines that he says that many of the readers were very upset with the articles of Diana, and that fits with this general climate of Antifa. But you see, I mean, during the electoral campaign, for example, they were definitely not for the lesser evil. They were very often their articles were against the idea of lesser evil, namely voting for Hillary in order to block Trump. But again, if you're really facing fascism and you really want to stop fascism, then you should do a united front, including with democratic, I mean, to speak like in the 30s, with democratic elements of the ruling class. That would be the communist language of the 30s. Then you would unite with them against fascism because the threat of fascism is too great. But then, of course, you should vote for Hillary Clinton, which they did not encourage. So I don't understand. I mean, does anybody believe that the violence of the anti-fascists is going to beat the violence of the fascists, assuming there is such, and the violence of the state, because they also think the state's on the side of the fascists. So, I mean, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, their assumptions don't make any sense that there is this threat of fascism. But if they make sense, then their tactic doesn't make any sense. So this is ridiculous. And then, of course, I always suspect some manipulation, but I have no proof of that. My argument doesn't rely on the fact that there's manipulation. I mean, it relies on the fact that politically it's completely crazy.
Well, you know, in this country anyway, the sort of Antifa movement has arisen from what have been described as white nationalist groups that have been particularly anti-Muslim in their rhetoric and so on. Well, we have an article here from RT which is headlined "Failed Integration. In the next 10 to 20 years, France will be the new Lebanon." And this is according to Alexandre Mandel, who has written a book called Partition, and the RT was speaking to him. And he's saying that Europe has been facing a large number of migrants coming from war-torn countries in Africa and the Middle East. Today, many are concerned about the Islamization of Europe and the failure of Muslims assimilating into their own countries. RT met with this writer and they asked him some questions. He said that Partition is mainly about Islamization of France, about what's going on in France in schools, hospitals, at work, in sports clubs, etc. I'm not talking about the time, about terrorism itself, but about the way France decided whether the French government, like it or not, collaborated and accepted some kind of arrangements with Islam. That is a big question, and many people focus on Islam and on immigrants and immigration. They don't look at the policies of government, but I think it's perhaps a bit far to suggest that there's any collaboration going on here, Jean.
Oof, that's a complicated question. You see, first of all, if you look at our society, then the thing which is striking, at least for somebody of my age, is the Americanization. The Americanization has been going on since the end of the war, and especially after '68, it went on and on and on, and we have all become American liberals. The left is American liberals. That's what it means now. There's no left in the sense of the socialist left. I mean, maybe Corbyn is revitalized that, but until recently there was no left except liberal Americans in Europe. So it's all Americanization. And then, of course, if you really look at the policy, especially with the Middle East, then it's entirely Zionized. We always see things through the eyes of Israel and Jewish suffering and so on and so forth. And we put that above. We have laws that put people in jail if they challenge the Holocaust. We have laws that put people in jail if they are anti-Semitic, or they can be heavily fined, etc. People lose their reputation, they lose their jobs, they lose, if they're accused of anti-Semitism, everybody trembles in front of that. Of course, I agree that in some circles it's not good to be accused of being anti-Muslim, but nevertheless, I mean, if you look at the cover of the main magazine, you know, the covers are full of attack against Islam. For example, when the Italian polemicist after 9/11 wrote a book, well, in French it's La Rage et l'Orgueil, the rage and the pride. It's something like that. I don't know exactly the English title. Oriana Fallaci,
Yes.
and she said that the Muslims multiply like rats. Okay, now try to say that about Jews, even blacks, or Arabs even. I mean, it's only because it's Muslim. Okay, and then you say, that's a criticism of religion. Okay, it's not a criticism of religion to say they multiply like rats. Okay, that's going a bit too far. I'm all for criticism of religion, but that's not. And she managed to make the cover of one of the main magazines. I think it was L'Express or Le Point, saying that's the woman who dares to defy Islam. So we have this joke constantly that people are very insulting to the Muslims, and at the same time they're praised for having the courage to do so because supposedly it's not politically correct to do so. Which is of course true, because then there is a reaction in the marginal part of the left, which tend to defend Muslims at all costs, and I don't think they have a very intelligent reaction again. But of course the main discourse in France is very much anti-Muslim. They have banned the scarves for girls in school, and they are doing everything to, there are all kinds of agitation against the Muslims. So I think this article in RT is very misguided. I have lots of problems with RT when it comes to immigration, etc. Now I agree that there may be a danger of a Lebanization of France, but if you want to prevent that, the first thing to do is to try to make bridges with the Muslim community, which I'm trying to do at a high level by discussing with them. And I can discuss with them even about religion and so on, because I'm not hysterical against them, and people are hysterical against them, so the Muslim just, you know, it's like North Korea. If you're attacked, then you defend yourself by closing in. And that seems to be completely counterproductive. And again, knowing how it is in France, I don't know about the UK, but in France, I can easily show that there is a big relation between this agitation against Islam and the supporters of Israel again. I mean, they are most of them are at the forefront of the agitation against Islam. So I found that very one-sided, let's say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Now, let's move on to the Iran deal. And there seems to be a split in viewpoints between the United States and Europe, and certainly your own president, Macron, seems to be the man who's pushing the European narrative here. He says he warned Trump not to scrap the Iran deal, according to this article from The Hill. Yes, Jean, go ahead.
Well, I think that's the good part of Macron, is that, I mean, he represents a capitalist interest, so he's against these humanitarian wars. He wants good relations with Russia, good relations with Iran, and that's something I did for a lot of time. You see, all these policies in the Middle East are not in the interest of the oil company, they are not in the interest of the capitalists, they are not even in any geostrategical sense in the interest of the United States. They are just pushed by fanatical supporters of Israel. I don't think in the long run it's good for Israel either, by the way, and certainly not good for the Jews. But those fanatics, the neoconservatives, are pushing for that policy, and because they always manipulate the accusation of anti-Semitism to silence their adversaries, they manage to get their viewpoint. That was the case for the Iraq war and every other war after that, the Syria, etc., the agitation against Iran. Why do you care about Iran? Why do I care if Iran has nuclear power plants? And why should I care even if they have nuclear weapons? This is going to be a deterrent towards Israel, that's all. I mean, I have nothing to do there. I mean, I don't think they will attack us with nuclear weapons. They would be wiped out in a minute if they did that. So why would they do that? It's just like North Korea. These countries look for deterrence. I'm not saying that this is a happy situation in the sense that, of course, you have always the risk of an accidental nuclear war, for example. But if you want to prevent that, then you should at least have a détente first. And the country who doesn't want any détente, doesn't want to yield anything, is Israel again.
And do you think it is Israel that's driving Trump's foreign policy at the moment? I mean, obviously during the campaign for his election, he was saying he would not be interventionist, and yet we seem to be seeing the opposite now that he's president.
Always said, you see, he's ambiguous. He's been anti-interventionist, but he's always been against the Iran deal. He always said it was a bad deal, and we give them money, etc. I mean, Trump is not Ron Paul. Okay, he's not a genuine anti-interventionist. He's always very militaristic, bombastic. He likes to boom, 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 me King Kong, etc. And I'm going to, show everybody that I'm the strongest. He's very macho and so on. So he's not really anti-intervention. I never trusted him. I like some of the things he said, for example, about having better relations with Russia. And I always thought that the craziest thing, that again gets us back to the Democrats and the liberals and the Antifa, etc., is that everybody attacks him for the thing which is good in him, namely the fact that he wants good relations with Russia, and then he's accused to be a Russian pawn, which is probably not, and that's really what is crazy about the opposition to Trump. But on the Iran deal has always been bad, on Palestine has always been very bad, on Venezuela, Cuba, etc. has always been very bad. So I don't think there is anything surprising here. But I want to emphasize the fact that, of course, Trump wants the support of the most extreme Zionists, like the Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. But he doesn't have the support of more mainstream Zionists who are, for example, often pro-immigration. He's anti-immigration, who are anti-Russian. He's pro-good relations with Russia. But of course, he feels that he needs the support of some Zionists because they're so important on all sides. So maybe that's the reason. Maybe it's his son-in-law. I don't know, but that's why he adopts the most extreme Likudnik position. I mean, Likudnik meaning Netanyahu position.
Have you any thoughts on that?
No, not really. I mean, I agree with Sean on this. I think Trump himself he's an enigma to a great degree. I mean, we see him going off like a Catherine wheel most of the time. And his pre-election speeches were promising. Are we seeing an indication of influence being put upon him by the deep state? By there's all of these elements in there, and of course the Israeli influence.
Jean, one of the things that fascinated me. Sorry, go ahead.
On Iran, he has always been very hostile, and personally, I like some of what he says, protectionism and good relation with Russia, but I never trusted him to act on those things. First of all, I don't believe that there is a democracy in the US, so you vote for somebody. If they voted for Sanders, he would have another policy. If you vote for Syriza, you get another policy. I mean, if you vote against the mainstream, you don't get what you vote for. So I did not expect him to do anything. And on Iran, he has always been very clear. He's always been against the deal. So he's not surprising there. He's not following the deep state. He just is his position, which is a position of U.S. power, which is itself manipulated by pro-Israeli forces.
But one of the things that's fascinating, I think, is that if you look back at the closing months of the Obama presidency, there was a certain degree of schizophrenia with regard to their foreign policy. And we had various State Department going one way and so on. And that seems to a degree carried over into the Trump presidency.
Yes. Yeah, I would say we have Trump making a statement, we have Tillerson making another statement quite often, and Haley, of course, just on her own wreck.
The country is divided in people. You see, you can be, the people are the more purest pro-capitalist people are the libertarians, like Ron Paul or antiwar.com. And these people are totally against interventions. And it's perfectly rational from their point of view. Capitalism nowadays, I'm not speaking about the past, but nowadays, doesn't need all these interventions. They can trade with whoever wants to trade. China wants to trade, Russia wants to trade, Iran wants to trade. They don't have to use the gunboat diplomacy to open borders. So we are in a different situation, let's say, that at the time of the Opium War or something like that, and we should not mix up those situations. So I think, we have to realize that. And then there's this Israeli component, and of course, then they encourage they link the military-industrial complex to the militaries, to the human rights people, because there's all the human rights crowd who wants more intervention, etc. So you have a tension between these two things. That's why the U.S. policy is incoherent whoever is president, because they have this foreign influence, and then this foreign influence is linked to all kinds of ideological currents. On the other hand, of course, the capitalists have also their say in U.S. foreign policy, but they are not the only way. Many Marxists and many of my leftist friends think only the capitalists run the show, but that's not true. There are opposing forces, and that's why it's incoherent.
Perhaps one area that we see a bit of the schizophrenia most is with regard to North Korea. So I've just chosen Vice News here as a typical mainstream headline, but of course they're saying Washington. Here's the problem here, because we've got Deutsche Welle and a bunch of other mainstream news outlets over the last number of months saying or admitting that there are back-channel talks going on with North Korea. So what is the truth? On one hand, we've got Trump tweeting out all this rhetoric about North Korea. On the other hand, we've got back-channel talks going on. And my question, Jean, really is the noise that's generated by Trump and his entourage on Twitter and so on, is this just to keep the mainstream media busy while he's trying to manage a situation which they would have blown out of all proportion very quickly?
I don't know. I would expect that, again, there are forces in the U.S. who want negotiation, because there is no alternative except a nuclear war that would be devastating for Japan or South Korea at the very least, certainly for Japan. There's no way that they can find a militaristic solution, but of course some think that it's a trump card, if I may say, in his game to threaten North Korea and then negotiate a position of strength, you see. He thinks that negotiations have failed because they were not in the position of strength. And he's certainly a Mac politiker. There is no doubt that he thinks in terms of relationship of forces, and he wants the U.S. to be the strongest. That's even a non-interventionist could be like that. But nevertheless, I don't know where this is going to lead to. I'm slightly optimistic that there won't be a war, because the consequences are so devastating, and it seems to be that all sides realize that. So it seems that what Trump is doing is fostering, but I don't know. Maybe wrong, and maybe there will be a war. In which case, everything else will be a detail.
Yes.
Even neutral pronoun and transgender bathrooms.
Have you any thoughts on this?
No, I think it's a huge amount of brinkmanship, and certainly speaking to Ava Bartlett and Tim Anderson, who've just come back from North Korea, quite simply, the Northern Korean people are not going to give in to any sort of economic pressures or any sort of diplomatic pressures. They have a right to a deterrent, as Jean mentioned earlier in the program. All of these nations have a right to a deterrent because they've been hideously attacked and persecuted by the US and by its various client states. So, we should not be surprised, and look at what happens when a nation removes its deterrents. Like, for example, Syria was largely unprotected, and look what happens. So, they're learning from the lessons of Iraq and from Libya and from Syria. And in my opinion, as Jean said, it's not an ideal situation, but these countries have a right to deter such attacks, and to deter from all directions, whether it's diplomatic attacks, political attacks, economic attacks, military attacks, land grab attacks, it doesn't matter. But they have this right. And that's what we should actually, I think, be defending and be understanding. Putin has been very, very intelligent in this. He said, look, the one thing that will protect North Korea is international law, the supremacy of law. But that doesn't only work for Korea, for North Korea, that works for everyone. The US, the UK, the entire US coalition and its client states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, are acting lawlessly. They're acting as rogue states.
No.
Yes, Jean.
Yes. No, I agree with Vanessa about that. I have nothing to add about North Korea.
Okay, and I mean, in France, then Macron, we've been hearing over the last few weeks in the British press, at least, and particularly from the BBC, that the French people despise Monsieur Macron. Is that a realistic impression? Is that actually what's going on? And if so, is he going to survive his term? And what support does he have for his foreign policy agenda?
Well, you see, I think he can survive because he has a majority in the National Assembly, and that's not going to collapse. And then if he wants, I mean, Hollande was in the single-digit popularity, and he still remained till the end of his term. I think he can remain unless there would be massive street demonstration or something like that, or massive strikes. And even that is not, but that's not in the card. I think he's unpopular. Well, his economic policies, of course, are unpopular, let's say, in part of the population. Then he makes several gaffes by always insulting the French in foreign newspapers, saying they are lazy, they are jealous, or something like that. And that's really a completely silly way to act. So I don't know. He doesn't seem to. I don't know how popular he is. He certainly. It was interesting that after he made this statement that he won't arm the rebels, there was a problem with the chief of the army, and the media all took the side of the chief of the army against him. While before, up until his election, the media had been overwhelmingly in his favor. I don't know if there is a correlation between the two, but there is certainly, the media are probably lukewarm towards his, foreign policy. But of course, the thing which is on the cards now, of course, is the domestic policy, and of course, he's all for European construction and so on. So that makes him relatively popular with the media. I don't know where this is heading to, but it's interesting to see that there is a difference between his policy, which is, which of course is very pro-Israel and so on, he cannot do anything else, but he's at least in other fronts like Syria, Iran, Russia, etc., he's for détente, and that's a good sign. I say it just reflects the fact that he represents the interest of the capitalists, and the capitalists want that. They want to trade. I mean, after all, many of the interventions in the past against socialist regime or quasi-socialist regime or nationalist regime, etc., were done in order to force trade, like, forcing open border. I mean, the Opium War was one example, but then you had they wanted the people like overthrow Mossadegh or Arbenz. I mean, all the economic nationalists of the past, all the, countries that wanted to have a certain degree of self-sufficiency were under threat and were attacked. But now they are refusing to trade with countries who want to trade with them. And that's what that is what novelty is. And I gave my explanation for that.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean. I think we're just about out of time. You any closing thoughts?
No, just thank you so much, Jean, for coming on.
Okay, thank you. And we will be back at the same time, 1 o'clock on Monday. We will see you then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.